All right, so a little bit of history for some of you guys, and some of you know this, just if you do, just hang in there with me. But about 30 years before Jesus was born, there's a guy shows up in history. Now, he was a slave. He had been captured from the area of Bulgaria. He was a soldier, and you probably know when the Romans, when they went to war with somebody, if they captured you, if you fought against Rome, you're pretty much going to be a slave. And there's different levels of slaves. There's slaves that just sent to the salt mines, so those guys are expendable. If they croak off, there's no big deal. Other slaves had more value for in the home use and stuff. The young ones, the beautiful ones, they get put in people's homes, sold into people's homes. But some of these guys, particularly ex-soldiers, they used them for a specific thing. If they were any good at all, they would put them in the gladiator pits. Almost all the gladiators, if you've seen the movie Gladiator, almost all the gladiators were actually slaves. And they, of course, were expendable, but they could be used. And they got very, very popular, by the way, they were like major sports stars, except they were slaves. They were locked in their little prisons, and they couldn't get out. And about 30 years before the birth of Christ, there was a slave. He's captured from Bulgaria, captured in a Roman war. And you might remember his name because they made a couple movies of him. In fact, I have a picture of him. His name was Spartacus. There he is, okay? He had a cleft chin, just like that guy. Does that name ring a bell, Spartacus? Well, Spartacus actually, he and some other guys, they were gladiators, and he busted out of his gladiator prison and rounded up because he did some math. He realized that in Rome, that one out of three people in Rome, in the whole Roman world, were actually slaves. And he did the math and he goes, if 1 out of 2 Romans are women, okay, and 1 out of 3 slaves are highly motivated, we could get our freedom. And he busted out with another couple other guys, and they got busy building an army, and they had an army of thousands of guys, and they literally went to war against Rome. And they won a bunch of battles, and that scared the bejeebers out of the Romans. Because it was the number one fear the Romans had. They had the fear that the slaves might have an uprising and go against them. And Spartacus was leading the way. He was charging across Rome, and at first they didn't take him seriously. These bunch of slaves. But he had organized an efficient army because there were enough of them that had military service, and they had a high motivation, and they were doing some real damage. So Rome put all their money and all their men at crushing this rebellion, and they were successful. Spartacus was killed in battle in 71 BC, and they killed most of his soldiers, but they managed to capture 6,000 of these rebel slaves. And what they did with them, because they wanted to make sure that nobody would ever, ever, ever think to do this again. They wanted to make a very graphic and horrible example out of them, so that any slave that thought about casting off the chains of their captors would think twice before they did it. The road lining to Rome was lined with all 6,000 of these men, every single one of them crucified. Okay? That's a lot of guys. And they stretched all the way from the city of Rome for miles and miles and miles of crucified slaves. There was never another slave rebellion in Rome until it wasn't even a slave rebellion. But they did the same thing to anybody that tried. Okay? And they set an example. This message is about crucifixion. But it wasn't unique to Christ. Crucifixion is what the Romans used for non-Roman citizens. It was only for non-Roman citizens. They would not that's why Paul was beheaded and Peter was crucified, because Peter was not a Roman citizen, and so he could be crucified. And as many of you know, history tells us he was crucified by his own request upside down. And they would do that. They would crucify people in all kinds of different strange things just for kicks. So the Romans were extremely cruel. But Paul was beheaded because he was a Roman citizen. And it was only for non-Roman citizens, but it was especially for rebels. And so therefore, like the thieves on the cross, they weren't guys who just, were ripping off 7-Eleven. They were guys who were probably stealing military equipment or horses or some sort of gear to use for a rebel cause. They were clearly identified as rebels, and that's why they were crucified. Otherwise, they wouldn't have been punished in that way. And it was very intentionally brutal and painful in every conceivable way. Because as many of you know, the death of crucifixion was actually a death of suffocation. You were designed so that you were hanging on that cross, and in order to breathe, you'd have to do a push-up, and if your feet were nailed, you had to stand on your feet and do a push-up on that, or pull-up, on that, in order to get a breath. And eventually, you'd wear out, and you'd die slowly of suffocation. Usually took days. And if you didn't die of suffocation, like those 6,000 guys along the road, the wild animals would come out at night and chew on them. Okay? Or diseases, the wounds would get infected and they die of sepsis. So it was designed to be long, torturous, and public. Okay? It was done to humiliate the individual and to show the immense power of Rome and to be a warning to others. And into the middle of that comes Jesus. They would take these guys, and once they were condemned, they would parade them through town. And they would carry the top beam of the cross. The crosses that you normally see look like a small T. But they're actually more like a capital T with a little bit on the top. That's most of the crosses look like that. And the top beam would come off, and you'd carry the top beam through town. And everybody would throw things at you and laugh at you and humiliate you. The Roman citizens, at least, would all go, "You deserve this. You're a rebel." It'd be like if you were in New York City after 9/11 and they caught some ISIS guys or some Al Qaeda guys, right? People just would throw stuff at them, harass them, and it was part of the humiliation. And that's where we pick up Matthew 27. The soldiers assigned to the governor took Jesus into the governor's palace and got the entire brigade together for some fun. They stripped him and dressed him in a red robe. Red, by the way, was a color the emperors oftentimes wear, or at least a senior member would wear. They dressed him in a red robe. The emperors wore purple. They plaited a crown from branches of a thorn bush and set it on his head. They put a stick in his right hand for a scepter. Then they knelt before him in mocking reverence. "Bravo, King of the Jews," they said. "Bravo." And they spit on him, hit him in the head with the stick. And when they had their fun, they took the robe off and put his own clothes back on him. And they proceeded out to the crucifixion. That would have been somewhat unusual behavior, but not the taunting. They did this to Jesus because of his crime. His crime actually was written on a piece of wood or piece of paper and tacked up above the cross above him. And basically it says, it said his name, Jesus of Nazareth, King of the Jews. By the way, the Pharisees objected to that. They said, no. It should be correctly said, he said he was a king of Jews. Remember Pilate's response is, "I've written what I've written. Live with it." So they would take him to the place of the cross. And by the way, this was a public place. You go through a main street. If you've been to Jerusalem, you walk the way of the cross. But many people walked that way. Anybody who's going to be crucified walked that way. And they all went to the same place. Oftentimes it's right outside the city walls on a road leading to the city. And there was a place carved out with holes in the ground they could drop the crosses in. And because crucifixion was not an unusual thing in a Roman-occupied place. And when they got you there, they would strip you completely naked. Everybody who was crucified was stripped completely naked. And they were placed for death along the main highway so that as people were coming and going, they could harass them. They could laugh at them. Or they'd if they were thinking of maybe going that direction in some sort of revolutionary way, they go, I think I'm going to join a different party. Right? Arriving at Golgotha, the place they called the Skull Hill, that's what it literally translated means. Golgotha means the hill of the skull. They offered him a mild painkiller, a mixture of wine and myrrh. But when he tasted it, he wouldn't drink. After they'd finished nailing him to the cross and were waiting for him to die, they killed time by throwing dice for his clothes. And above his head, they posted the criminal charge against him. This is Jesus, the King of the Jews. Now, while this was going on, of course, we know from Scripture that Mary was there, and most of the disciples had run for the hills, but a few other people were gathered around, and his friends. But most of the people were hostile. They were the people that it was their responsibility that put him there, that brought him before the Romans. And so it was their turn to mock him and laugh at him and spit on him. And there was obviously nothing he could do. And they'd gather by and watch his agony or taunt him. And this whole thing was designed to shame the victim. Along with him, they crucified two criminals, one to his right, the other to his left. People passing along the road jeered, shaking their heads in mock lament. You bragged you could bring down the temple and rebuild it in 3 days. So show us your stuff. Save yourself. If you're really God's son, come down from the cross. The high priest, along with the religious scholars and leaders, were right there mixing it up with the rest of them and having a great time poking fun at him. He saved others. Can't save himself. King of Israel, is he? Then let him get down off of that cross. We'll all become believers then. Well, he's so sure he's of God. Let him rescue his son now if he wants him. Did he claim to be God's son? Didn't he? And even the two criminals crucified next to him joined in the mockery. Now, we know later on one of them changed his mind. But in the initial part, everybody was piling on. Now, crucifixion, because it took a long time, days, many days sometimes. Normally, that would be the Romans didn't care about time. You know, the guards were bored. They'd have to switch out guards and stuff. And they stayed there to make sure nobody would come and try to rescue anybody off the cross. But because the Passover was coming, because they were in a foreign country, these Roman guys were in a foreign country, and they were so much sensitive to what was happening within that context. They knew it was a holy day. The pressure was on them to just get this thing over with, get it done. And so typically what they would do is one of the Roman soldiers would take a large iron bar, and he'd walk up, because remember it's crucifixion, you have to be able to push up on your feet and pull on your arms. And they'd come by and they'd break the legs of the prisoners on the cross so they could no longer push and pull themselves up. Sometimes they'd break their arms as well, so that there's no possible way they could do it, and suffocation would come really, really fast. They broke the legs of the other prisoners when they came to Jesus. They found he was dead already. And as you remember from the other Gospels, they record that this, they wanted to make sure, so they thrust a spear into his heart. From noon to 3, the whole earth was dark. Around mid-afternoon, Jesus groaned out of the depths, crying out loudly, my God, why have you abandoned me? Some bystanders heard him and said, he's calling for Elijah. One of them ran and got a sponge soaked in sour wine and lifted it up in a stick so he could drink. He refused that drink, by the way. Others joked, don't be in such a hurry. Let's see if Elijah comes and saves him. But Jesus, again crying out loudly, breathed his last. That's Matthew's description of the crucifixion. You can compare with the other Gospels. They add elements, leave out elements that Matthew put in. But had this been just a story of the end of a story, it would have been a tragedy. It would have been a unremarkable guy in a foreign country that for a while did some things that got himself crucified, and the story would have evaporated into the dustbin of history. It's what came after that takes the story from one-dimensional into three-dimensional. I don't get to talk about what came after that. You'll have to imagine. Still, I find it really interesting because, well, for example, on a few things, how did the instrument of his death become a symbol of hope that the world grabs onto? It's one of the most bizarre things, I think, if you ever stop and consider it. Imagine if a guillotine, okay? If you wore a little guillotine around your neck, if your building had a guillotine up on top, you had some guillotine earrings, you know? If Madonna wore a guillotine necklace, you know, well, maybe she would. But, or a noose, you know? The sign of your gathering together is a noose. That would seem a little macabre, right? Or maybe you could just go all the way and get an Iron Maiden, okay? Something of horror torture, and that was what typified your gathering of people whose job is to love each other. Yeah, we love each other. This is our symbol, you know? Or, I mean, simply enough, a swastika even. If that was, what message did that give? When somebody saw a cross 2,000 years ago, it was this. It was those other things. It was not something to be celebrated. How do we get there? Why do we get there? To where we put it out and people go, that's a symbol of hope. You see, it's one of the many paradoxes that surrounds this marvelous and scandalous night on the cross. And as I was thinking about this is where the meditation comes in. I started to think about all the crazy paradoxes that the cross thing, and the only way you could view these paradoxes is from the lens of the resurrection. You could never view them while they were happening. While they're happening in real time, there was nothing paradoxical about it. And by the way, if I'm using a word you don't understand, a paradox is an idea, a fact, a statement that seems contradictory or opposed to common sense and yet is true. Okay? So I started thinking about all this stuff that went on. I go, wow. So here's my list of paradoxes of what took place on that day. In the garden, facing brutality of the cross. This is in the garden. This has from a week or so ago while we were talking about what happened in Gethsemane. He conquered by surrendering. Remember, I'm going with you. He won by losing. His questioners, Pilate, asked him rhetorically, of course, what is truth? When in reality, the very one who was truth was standing right before him. The one who embodied all truth was standing right before him, and he couldn't see it. His response to the depths of human vengeance as they cried out, "Crucify him," demonstrated the heights of God's forgiveness, as what he prayed on the cross was, "Forgive them, for they do not know what they're doing." He allowed himself to be mocked as a pretend king, yet he was the king. And he will be the king that every tongue will acknowledge and confess, and every knee will bow. They crowned him in a crown of thorns and ridicule, yet he will be the one that every guy in a high position will throw their crowns at his feet, according to Scripture. What, as a condemning accusation they nailed on the cross, Jesus, King of the Jews, turned out to be exactly who he was. Not just King of the Jews, but King of everyone. Stripped naked in shame, he would go on to clothe those of us who are shameful in righteousness. See the paradoxes? You could never get those, you could never imagine those at the cross. But it goes on, unable to quench his thirst, he would then offer the world a chance to never thirst again. He turned the cross, a symbol of terror and human evil, into a symbol of hope. He established a universal peace by surrendering to violence. He turned the darkest hour of history to a time of greatest light. He turns man's sinfulness into God's holiness. He made an instrument of death into the way of salvation. And he solved man's inability to save himself by showing God's power to do it for them. And this is a short list. But see all those paradoxes, you would have never known that on that dark day. You would have never imagined any of those things, those contradictory ideas that turn out to actually be true, because we are a bunch of human idiots. We had no idea what we're doing. So no wonder the Catholics, our Catholic brothers, no wonder when they get a cross, they kiss it. You know? They should, for what it did, what it represents. So, what's our response? We see those things, go, whoa, yeah, I see how all that lines up, and it's trippy, I never thought about some of those things. But what's our response? I think that's what's really fascinating about this. What God calls our response to be is this, for ourselves to be a living human paradox. For us to be a living human paradox ourselves. He said so much. Jesus said so much in the book of Matthew. If anyone come after me, let him deny himself, take up his cross, follow me, and catch this paradox. For whoever would save his life would lose it. Whoever loses his life for my sake will find it. See, the paradox of the cross shows us what God can do. The things that we can't even imagine how they would work out. We find life by forgetting about ourselves. We find life by letting Christ live his resurrected self in us, through us. We find life by embracing suffering, by embracing misunderstanding, hostility, sacrifice, even loneliness and betrayal in the same way that Jesus did. We find life by trusting that regardless how horrific the circumstances might be, that God will someday, and sometimes there's a long pause in the someday, but that God will someday put it all right. That's how we respond to that. The Christian life ultimately is this. It's a paradox. It's riddled with paradox. You want to be happy? Then give away your love and your care and tenderness and forget about being happy. Let it go. The whole Christian life, when you read through the Gospels, it's all paradox. The cross was just the ultimate paradox. So I don't know any better way to close this message this morning than do this. For us to just take a moment, I'm going to ask Dane to come up and grab his guitar. I'll give him another chance. And we'll just join in one song together, singing one song just in thankfulness for the cross. Would you stand?